Welcome back to the Marc Claire Show. With me today, she is returning. She was here just about a month or so ago talking about the Tavistock Institute. Well, we didn't finish that conversation because there's so much to have, so I brought her back from the Courtenay Turner program. She is Courtenay Turner. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. Yeah.
Why, of course.
Lots to talk about.
There's lots to talk about. Like we said last week, I think we could have its own. I'm surprised. I'd be surprised if they wasn't actually. Do you know if the current Tavistock Institute has their own podcast?
I don't think they do, but the people involved in it do a lot of podcasting. They do conferences constantly, and they do a lot of podcasting.
There is Tavistock Inside the Gender Clinic podcast, but that looks like a series.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. They're very focused on the gender affirming stuff. That's kind of what like blew the whistle on them, I guess. Like what kind of blew the lid so that people started to become aware of them. I think before that, they were kind of just like this shadow think tank that most people had never heard of, but then they got sued for the whole transgender scandal. I actually have somebody coming on my show next week who was a social worker in the UK, and he was talking about how like they're pretty much forcing you to impose these gender affirming type of mindset onto the kids. Yeah,
that was a lawsuit in the UK.
Yeah, the Tavistock Clinic got sued. A bunch of parents like rose up and sued the clinic in 2020.
They're like, "Hey, we sent our kid because he was sad and he came back a different gender. So
right,
what's going on here?"
Yeah, they weren't too happy about that, and that was in 2020 when that all went down. Yeah, so it was kind of then that people started to become aware of Tavistock. I think before that, most people had never heard of it.
Right.
So I was just on Benjamin Boyce's podcast, and he covers a lot of the trans stuff, and he said to me, "Oh, the mental health clinic," and I said, "Well," because I was talking about the history of it, that it was the propaganda bureau. And
like, how much time do you have?
Yeah, I know. And he was like, "Wait, you're telling me that the mental health clinic is a propaganda bureau?" I'm like, "Yeah, that's how it started."
Wait till you find out that's what it's always been. All right.
Yeah, and that's what it still is.
For if you are just tuning in and you didn't catch our previous episode on Tavistock, it is called The Tentacles of Tavistock Part 1. This is Part 2. It's just about 5 or 6 episodes back in your podcast feed. So I highly recommend, if you didn't catch that episode of The Marc Claire Show, go back, check it out, and then come right back here. And because we're going to basically pick up essentially where we left off there. But in that episode, you went through the whole history of Tavistock. And really by that, I mean almost everything leading up to it. All the different organizations, the different psychiatric groups, like doctors, theories, whatever you want to call it, all seemingly coming together and passing through in some way in this one institute. But today we're going to look a little bit more about how it's affecting society today. And obviously, like a big one we just started off with, we don't even necessarily need to go in order. We could actually just start here since it is such a big issue today, is this trans stuff. And actually, it was just a couple of weeks ago I heard some story and I heard something about the Tavistock Clinic. I was like, oh, well, that's obviously the same guys. Because I only recently became aware of the fact that they are such a huge part of the transgender push, especially over in the UK. So maybe you can detail a little bit more about what they've been doing over there, and we'll try to connect some dots along the way.
Yeah, so I mean, they really are a propaganda bureau, and that is, as we covered last time, that's what they started off as, and it was because Germany had a propaganda agency, and so under the guise of quote unquote defense, they started a British propaganda bureau, and the purpose was to garner acquiescence from the American populace as well as the British populace to engage in World War I on the side of the Brits. And that's kind of, they've been involved in, socially engineering the masses and culture creation pretty much from the inception. Like one of the very first things they did was they had a meeting with the 25 literary authors and, famous writers of the time to create propaganda like pamphlets and books all about war and why we should engage in war. And so now they're very involved in this whole transgender agenda. I mean, I would argue that it is an agenda. And personally, I think it's a huge part of the transhumanist agenda. And when you look at what Tavistock is doing right now, they're very involved in a lot of that. And that seems not to be new. Apparently, a lot of the members of Tavistock were decades ago going to cybernetics meetings. So I talk about how cybernetics, a lot of people are very concerned about, Elon just did his first experiment with the Neuralink and they're worried about chips. Greg Reese just did a great report all about, the luciferase and the glowing and how even people who have shedding are glowing.
Wait, what's the luciferase?
Luciferase.
I can't let that word just pass me by casually and not dig in further.
It's just a chemical, but it's used a lot of times in things to make things glow.
It's called luciferase?
It's called luciferase. And this was a huge part of like a lot of the conspiracy theorists back in 2020 were going nuts because there was luciferase in the injections. And so, of course, and
is that part confirmed? Is that there?
Yes. Luciferase is in the injection.
Feels a little too on the nose. Like maybe
that's kind of feels to me, but revelation of the method, maybe. I don't know. It does seem a little on the nose, but they argue that it's not what we think it is. And, that's just the name. It's not, Luciferian or anything. And there's nothing nefarious about it. It's not bad for you or anything like that. It's just, but they use luciferase even in like those markers that glow. It's really just so like if you inject it would, and you put it under one of those like lights, like a glow light to detect. You know what I'm talking about. I'm not using the right word, but then you'll see it. It'll come up, and so. Yeah. So, of course, the theory was that this was part of the mark of the beast, if you will. It was so that they could detect who had been jabbed and who hadn't. That part I can't speak to. Of course, we can continue to conjecture, and a lot more is coming out that seems to point in that direction. But no, the luciferase has been confirmed. Obviously, we can't confirm that it's in. There seem to be various batches and different things in different batches, and I do think that there were a lot of saline, a lot of control, if you will, controlled batches. So, and I think Moderna did that whole like, how bad is your batch? So we know there are different things in different ones, but anyhow, so people are very concerned about that type of transhumanism, where it's a machine human kind of convergence, biodigital convergence, and a literal merging with machines. But I think people forget about cybernetics, which I think has been well underway for a very long time. And it's because our brain chemistry, our neurology has already changed so much just by all of the screen time. And now with social media and the algorithms feeding us, the way we function, the way we think, the way we process, all of that, the way we interact even with each other has already changed. So that's cybernetics. And a lot of these people were going to the early cybernetics meetings. So I've seen some of their stuff on social media, and they seem to put things up, and it's almost like feelers because that's what they do, right? The social scientists are constantly testing behavior, and they do a lot of kind of what Edward Bernays called back then manufacturing consent. That's what he called polling. It was opinion making, not really sampling or surveying. So I think that's what they do. They kind of test and see the response, engage. But they did one I had posted a while ago, and it was all about it was some kind of symposium on AI and neurological changes, and they were doing another one kind of on social media and like the impact, the human impact of that. So I think they're very much moving in that direction. They deleted a bunch of these, by the way. But I still have the screenshot of one of them, but a lot of them have been deleted. You'll see they post it and got like 3 likes on it, or, it's,
this didn't go over well. Got ratio.
Yeah, exactly.
And they probably say, our intern just got in there and he posted that, weird satanic transhuman meme. Don't worry about him. But really they're just like, let's see how this goes over. No? Okay, maybe in a few years. We'll try that.
Yeah, right. we'll pause on that, and then we'll come back and revisit. So
it is
seem
a
like
logical conclusion, I suppose. If your goal is transhumanism, your goal is sort of like ending humanity for many people and perhaps extending it for a certain set of people, then it certainly makes sense that a natural transition, so to speak, is from the transgender movement. Because if you're going to tell people, well, if you feel different in your body, if you feel like you feel a little off today, maybe it's actually because you're the wrong gender. And so we can just change that. And if we can change that, why stop there? Because guess what? We have all this other technology. So why not put this chip in your brain? And maybe instead of turning your gender, we can just put the chip in your brain and change how your brain thinks. Maybe that's easier.
Exactly. Well, and I think it's also like it's a smoother transition if people don't feel an attachment to biology. So, if you blur the boundaries of what does it mean to be human, right? What does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be woman? Then, okay, so you can be anything. It's non-binary or whatever it is, then it's a more seamless kind of transition to, okay, so we merge with machines and, what difference does it make? And yeah, I think that's I think there's even a mimetic kind of right? Oftentimes they don't say transgender, they just say trans. So wait till they just stop saying transhuman and they just say trans.
Right, and it just applies to everything. It applies to all the ways we're just going to go in and tweak around in there.
Yes. So but these are the same people, and they've been really hard at work at shaping our perceptions, shaping our views of the world, testing us to see how they can shape us and manipulate us, and the implications of psychological warfare. Essentially, that's really what it is. It's all about psychological warfare, and so that's part of why they're so invested in the culture, because that's how they can really effectively use psyops through the culture.
Sure. And speaking on the culture, if you're going to influence the culture, you need to have influential people. And maybe nowadays, maybe a lot of the influences on, Instagram and YouTube and whatnot. At least maybe I just like to think so. I don't know. But they, back then, most of the influence, or I don't know. Maybe now at this point, I am so chicken and egg about everything. Like I used to just even say, oh, they infiltrated the music industry in order to prop up certain narratives or whatnot. But now I just wonder, does the music industry only exist because of this in the first place? Like, is it just like we have music because they figured out it's a way that they can manipulate us? Now I've probably gone too far and always questioning everything. But where does their entrance into, like, I guess the pop culture where does that begin? Does it begin with like the British music scene, or can we go back before that?
Oh, I would argue it goes way before
we did discuss the fiction actually last time. I think that was one of the last things.
Yeah,
we discussed,
it goes way back, and honestly, it doesn't even start with Tavistock. I mean, like they were doing this in ancient Greece. They were using it right. So I mean that the idea of using entertainment and using like pop figures or popular figures for the purposes of culture creation. I think that definitely goes back to, I think, probably the beginning of time. But the ancient Greeks were really good at it. That's part of where we got the Olympics, and the Roman bread and circuses. So yeah, this has definitely been in the works for a really long time. But Tavistock was definitely instrumental in the whole counterculture movement, which I think is what a lot of people are thinking of when they think about the music infiltration. But I would argue it definitely went way before that.
Was Tavistock, because I've recently been reading Weird Scenes in the Valley, and that's really about how the CIA sort of over in the Los Angeles Laurel Canyon end of things, and sort of all the rise of the hippie movement there, when all of these hippies just happen to be the sons and daughters and nieces and nephews of high level military intelligence and people involved in psychological operations and whatnot. Is that a direct extension of Tavistock, or were they kind of like sister movements of each other?
Oh yeah. And Tavistock had a lot of direct contact with both the OSS and the CIA. First the OSS, then the CIA, also MI6. Really that whole Five Eyes. They work with Tavistock. Rand Institute, which is basically like a psychological warfare think tank, right? They work very closely with Tavistock. Stanford Research Institute also another very involved in a lot of military projects. And it was under Stanford Research Institute that Changing Images of Man was written. That document was Joseph Campbell. And that was very much Tavistock propaganda. It was all about the age of Aquarius, and essentially, I mean, it's a pretty long document. I actually think I'm going to do a show just covering that because there's so much in it, and we're seeing so much of it play out now. But it was the idea that astronomers think that we're going to move into the age of Pisces, and from Pisces, then it's the end of the Christ age, and so this is, of course, the rise of kind of like the New Age type of philosophies and religions. And yeah, so that was all under Tavistock through Stanford Research. And then, I don't know, they're all of, but they're very, very interconnected.
Today's episode is sponsored by Fox & Sons Coffee. And let me just tell you, Stephen of Fox & Sons, he is not just an advertiser. He has been a supporter of this show from day one. And frankly, since before day one, because he came over with me from the old Lions and Liberty days. So true fan of the show. He started this company, Fox & Sons, out of his love for coffee and really out of wanting to further bond with his sons and spend time with him, just like he shared time with his father drinking coffee. He also gets to teach his sons about entrepreneurship and business through this endeavor. So I'm so happy to have Stephen and really his whole family, the Fox and the Sons, the whole gang, as supporters and sponsors of this show. Not only that, his beans are so high quality, fresh. Look, I just got 2 new bags right here. I got the Mexican and my favorite, the Den Blend Dark. The beans are super high quality, fresh and sourced from small organic farms, fair trade, none of this GMO garbage. They're all small batch roasted. This is high quality stuff. Subscriptions are by far the best way to get your coffee. I have a couple subscriptions going, but that is the way to go. You never run out that way. I never run out. I always have my supply of Fox & Sons. So I want you to head over to foxandsons.com, put in your order today. They ship fast. They ship now through the end of February. Also, by the way, you're going to get free shipping on any order over $37.99. By the way, while you're there, use discount code MCS to get 18% off any order over $25. Stephen Fox is a great man, a great friend, great supporter of the show. I encourage you to check out his coffee over at foxandsons.com. Let's touch on some of the big ones, some of the favorites out here. I mean, like Beatles, at least maybe on the British side, we can start. Beatles, Rolling Stones. Like, how, maybe you can describe a little bit, like, how does this start? Is it a straight recruitment from the beginning kind of thing where there's an idea, like, we're gonna make some propaganda. We're gonna, try to move things a certain way. So let's go find some musicians and prop them up. Or is it like there's these, maybe legit sort of like, Brits who get together, form a band, they get popular, they're pretty good. And then these guys come in and they're like, hey, you want to join with our label? Hey, we got a producer. Hey, and then do they influence the people already there? And maybe it's, again, sort of a chicken and egg thing because the end result is kind of the same. But how do you think this whole thing kind of like, how does it start?
Honestly, I feel like I have to do more research on all of it. And I'll tell you why. It's because I see a lot of like inferences, but I've yet to find very hard evidence. The Rolling Stones, were mastered by Order of Malta by the name of Prince Rupert Lowenstein, who sponsored Sympathy for a Devil track back in 1968. And then they say the prince was also a member of the very powerful Sacred Military Constantinian Order of St. George. But how do they know that? This is just one example. I've heard over and over again that Adorno was, who's, a philosopher from the Frankfurt School, that he wrote the Beatles lyrics. Now, I don't doubt that that's true. It's entirely possible. It definitely does seem like there was some sort of a messaging coming from Frankfurt School, Tavistock. Frankfurt School and Tavistock worked it was mostly the same philosophers and psychologists. There were a lot of overlap and convergence through them. And it makes perfect sense. And I can see why they would use something like the Beatles to create a major psyop to be able to control the masses. But I haven't found anything that actually shows that Adorno wrote the lyrics. I just don't know where the evidence is coming from. So I don't know. I know that Eustace Mullis says it. He's an author. I know Dr. John Coleman says it. Dr. John Coleman has no sources though. So like, I think we talked about this last time. So he's just, he was a former MI6. And so a lot of it is coming from his, independent sources that directly, or coming from libraries that he has access to that have redacted material. So he can't take pictures. He can't cite any of his work. That's not to say that it's not true. I just haven't found anything that proves it.
Yeah, I mean, even with the whole Laurel Canyon scene and everybody coming up there, there's a lot of there's so many connections, but there's not as much. I don't think there's that much evidence in the traditional sense of we have the document of the guy that said, "Hi, I am going to prop up Jim Morrison as the Doors," and there's not like that direct evidence, but there is a insane amount of circumstantial connections to the point that you would have to just be blind to say, okay, there's clearly an influence here, and these clearly can't be coincidences at this level.
No.
Do you know much about, if there's any, I don't think there is, but if there's any connections between the Beatles themselves or the Rolling Stones themselves and any of the intelligence agencies through their families? Because there just is galore on the Laurel Canyon side of things. Almost, like I said, almost literally every, which is funny because so many of them are anti-war, peace and love hippies.
Oh yeah.
But their family are actually the ones literally putting on the wars. It's funny.
But that was one of Tavistock's slogans, right? The peace war operation. We're going to achieve peace through war. So that was literally a Tavistock campaign. I don't know. I thought John Lennon might have had some ties, some intelligence ties, but that I don't know for sure. Yeah, I think he may have. I know that, so when you talk about direct evidence, things like the Grateful Dead and the whole drug movement, and we have direct kind of ties to Tavistock. Eric Trist's son, Alan Trist, was the producer for Grateful Dead. Alan Trist was one of the forerunner psychologists for Tavistock Institute of Human Relations. And his son was then the producer for the Grateful Dead. And then you have all of the LSD experiments that were done. Of course, that connection comes from L.D. Lang, who was a director of Tavistock. And then he met Bateson. I have the whole connection here. And Bateson was the daughter, Catherine Bateson was the daughter of, was it Margaret Mead? And let me find it exactly, but I don't want to get this. But he was also involved, the father was also involved in the LSD experiments. And they did do as a mass kind of a test on the population to see how people would, okay, here it is. 1956, R.D. Lang was appointed as senior registrar at the Tavistock Clinic in 1956, 3 years after he left the British Army Psychiatric Unit. So he had direct ties to, most of Tavistock was about, psychological warfare research. That was how they began. So he began experimenting with LSD in 1960, and then in 1962, when he became a family therapist at the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations, he also met Gregory Bateson. While visiting the U.S., Bateson had been with the Office of Strategic Services, so that's the OSS, forerunner CIA, and then he led the MK Ultra hallucinogen LSD project. Bateson and Margaret Mead's mother, Catherine Bateson, along with New Ager Jean Houston, would later help Hillary, write the It Takes a Village. Remember that?
Wow.
Yeah. And that was in
quite a resume.
Mm-hmm. And then in 1964, Lang met LSD proponent Timothy Leary in New York, and also authored Transcendental Experience in Relation to Psychosis. So there's a direct kind of connection there for sure. And it was mostly about the LSD experiments and seeing how that impacted the masses.
Do you think that is the greater purpose behind, at least maybe we can separate some of these? I mean, I'd think that the Grateful Dead and like Fish and bands like that are a certain type of band who are quite literally, I mean, people don't go to those shows without psychedelics. I mean, so is that the purpose of groups like that, to just outwardly promote? The Grateful Dead are the most on the nose, but I mean, even if we look at some Beatles songs, "Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds," pretty clear what's being referenced there. Is that the overall reason for at least some of these bands? I have to think is the reason.
Yeah, a huge part of it was to do testing, experimenting on the masses to see what the impact of these drugs would be, and how they could, permeate through the culture. I think it was multifaceted. I know they were trying to see what the results of LSD would be. They were searching for what they called a truth drug. It's in 1960, the psychedelic counterculture originated with Sandoz AG, an asset of S.G. Warburg and Co., one of the Federal Reserve Act founders. I recognize that
name from G. Edward Griffin's work.
Mm-hmm. Exactly, Creature from Jekyll Island. So they developed LSD. James Paul Warburg, who is the son of Paul Warburg, who had written the Federal Reserve Act in 1910 and sponsored the Nazi eugenics program. He financed a subsidiary of the Tavistock Institute in the United States, and that was called the Institute for Policy Studies. And their director was...
That's the most boring institute name I've ever heard.
Most of them are, especially the ones that here.
I guess they're not trying to say they don't want to be like institute for messing with your kids on drugs or anything like that. So.
Exactly. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Not that. They really didn't want much attention. It really wasn't until recently that there was any attention on them. Mm-hmm. To set up CIA. To set up, Mark Ruskin was appointed to National Security Council. James Paul Warburg set up a CIA program to surreptitiously experiment with LSD on human guinea pigs, some of whom committed suicide. And that program was the MK Ultra version, was supervised, obviously, by Gottlieb. Good.
I always wonder too, and I think this is very much just a speculatory area for both of us, but I always wonder about the artists themselves and they're because a lot of these kids are they're in their late teens, early 20s when they're starting to get into the music scene, and I just wonder how it works. Is it like, oh, Jim Morrison's dad, hey, you have a kid, we're looking to do a rock revolution, and we're looking to do some propaganda with music. Can we use your kid for that? Or is it like, or I mean, are they given permission? Are they handing the child over to become a star of some kind for this nefarious purpose? Or is it like Jim Morrison gets into music and they're like, hey, this is the stuff that kind of goes through my mind of how plotted out it is all from A to B, or is it just, a case of, well, we know these guys, we may as well use their kids. We already got them in our loop. Why recruit random kids?
I think it's a combination. You do have a lot of times where it's kept in the family, and we know this from studies like Project Monarch, right? Where they do this intergenerational trauma, in utero trauma, and they intentionally create dissociative personalities. And a lot of the
what is the in utero trauma?
So while they're in the womb. So while the mom is pregnant, they'll traumatize the mother intentionally to impact the child, because it makes them more susceptible to mind control.
Wow.
Yeah, it's pretty dark. Yeah.
Wow. That's the darkest thing I've heard in a while, I think. And that's saying a lot. Wow. So, but is this a situation where you're saying it's generational? So are these mothers or maybe the fathers sort of willing participants in the sense that they're just saying, hey, honey, we're going to bring you in for some tests?
Well, it's both. So we know from Project Monarch. So I'm specifically talking about Project Monarch right now, which I honestly don't think that MK Ultra could have occurred without the ground being laid by Tavistock. Tavistock really did, and so many of the same doctors and psychologists and psychiatrists were involved in the MK Ultra experiments. So there was a lot of crossover, but a lot of the research, preliminary research that was done through Tavistock on trauma-based mind control, what they call shell shock therapy, post-traumatic stress therapy, experiments were what were later utilized and expounded on in order to do these MK Ultra studies. I think the technology advanced with the MK Ultra studies, the medicalization of it increased, whereas a lot of the studies that were done under Tavistock were more psychology based and less drugs and less medical experimentation, device experimentation, if you will. But although they had some of that as well in Tavistock. But we know from Project Monarch that they were trying to figure out was the susceptibility of someone to trauma. So it really was about trauma-based mind control. And so they know that somebody who has been severely traumatized is much more susceptible to mind control. And I think this has been extrapolated onto the masses. And a really good example would be something like COVID. I do think that was a trauma-based mind control type. And it comes out of a lot of these Tavistock experiments, because Tavistock was all about group research. So you had, Rawlings Reese and Kurt Lewin. Kurt Lewin actually started the Research Center for Group Dynamics. And Wilfred Bion, it was all about group dynamics. Wilfred Bion's work got continued in the United States through A.K. Rice. The Rice Institute in the United States, it was I think 1957. I have to look up the exact date, but somewhere around there. Where they started that in the United States. And that's essentially like an American offshoot of Tavistock. And it's literally doing the same work. It's the extension of Wilfred Bion's work, who was very seminal to Tavistock. But it's all about group dynamics and figuring out how people's psychology changes in groups and how they can use groups to pit people against each other. And they even have, like how we have now sensitivity training, quote unquote, in corporations, a lot of, organizational psychology, a lot of corporate dynamics. I think the whole notion of public-private partnership, corporatocracy, all of that comes out of Tavistock research and Tavistock development. They really laid the groundwork for all of that. So it was all of these different, experiments that they were doing, and they realized that they could get people to, fight against each other. What I was saying about the sensitivity training, it was Frederick Emery. I think that it was his work. And they literally called it brainwashing. So what we now have as sensitivity training in corporations, which, it's all about, being
Maybe
nice.
It was supposed to sound nicer than it does to us now. It's like, we want to clean their brain. Let's just call it brainwashing. It's people like it.
Yeah, back then, everything was called hygiene. And hygiene really was just code for eugenics. But it was. I mean, they had mental hygiene. They had racial hygiene. They had, what was the other one? They had a whole bunch of hygiene organizations, but it was really just eugenics. That's what hygiene is code for. But yeah, I don't know. I think they were just more honest back then. I mean, Bernays called polling, manufacturing consent.
Right.
It basically told you what it was, and now we have all these euphemisms. They changed the names of everything. But yeah, so Project Monarch was, all about, they were trying to figure out trauma-based mind control, but through this, they realized that intergenerational trauma would make somebody much more susceptible. And so the families, some of them willingly went in, but some of them were already wounded from their trauma. So, what's the very cliche saying is hurt people, healed people, heal people. And so a lot of times they're a byproduct of already being a victim of, the intergenerational trauma, and therefore they perpetuate the cycle. And that's what these studies were done on. It was how, what would the ramifications be, and how could we create? They were looking at one of the main things they were looking at was dissociative personality disorder. And they found that somebody was much more likely to dissociate, which makes them a really great asset, because they have these various alters and they might not remember what they did in another alter. A great movie that's out right now that really touched on this, and they actually talk about MK Ultra. They use the term and they say that that's what's happening, but it's called Argyle, and this is she has these different alters, and that's what they found is that people who have an IQ over 120, So they would select for over 120 were much more likely to dissociate. It's just the brain's way of coping with trauma. But they were more likely, those who had experienced trauma were more likely, those who had experienced intergenerational or neurotrauma. There were a couple of other factors, but those are the main ones. And so I think that that's something that, so when you were asking about, do they keep it in the family, like with these, music figures, I think Hollywood is applicable here too.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And I think they do. I think it's both. I don't think it's, do they just self-select, or does it also just happen to occur? You've got somebody who's already in the system and they have a child. Likely that child has shared genetics. They might also have talent, but they already have that training. They've been around it. It's easier to groom them. So I think it's a combination. I mean, you just look at people like, Miley Cyrus, or right. I think that might be a good example right now, or even Taylor Swift. Her parents weren't in the industry per se, but they were in the banking industry. And I think
it's all the industry, really, isn't it?
Kind of. I mean, I think in that case it is, because I think I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure I read that she's actually directly related to one of the Federal Reserve founders. So
wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah.
I wonder then do you think that when we see the psychedelic movement hit the grand scale, which you could say maybe even culminated with, say, like a Woodstock in many ways, do you think is the attempt to bring like the experiments, the smaller scale experiments with like Monarch and Ultra, are we just now implanting that onto the masses, taking it to the next level?
Oh yeah. No, I think that's exactly what it was. I think that, they do these individual testing and then they extrapolate it from there. It's a way of figuring out how to control the masses. But yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. What's his name? Daniel Estlin has the Tavistock Institute book, and he has a whole section on the Age of Aquarius Woodstock Music Festival. Mm-hmm. And he goes into the Age of Aquarian conspiracy later. But yeah, I think Woodstock was absolutely a total CIA Tavistock experiment.
And it's funny. I mean, well, maybe not so funny, because my wife and I recently watched the documentary on Woodstock 99. I was at Woodstock 99 as a 19-year-old person who should not have been anywhere near this place. I now realize in hindsight. But luckily I got out of there alive, and I'm really lucky actually that I had a good friend of mine that came with us. There was like me and another friend that were kind of, let's just say, maniacs, and we were doing Woodstock things there. And another friend of mine who was like just wanted to watch the music, and then was smart enough to realize by like Sunday, like, we should probably leave. This is not a place we should be anymore. So we actually left Sunday before the fires and before I think there were some fires the night before.
I think there were.
Yeah, we were there for, I think, the Chili Peppers fire thing, but then the real crazy stuff was like the next day, was overnight, and the next day. But yeah, I mean, when we were watching that back, I was just thinking to myself, like, all I could think was, this is not a series of in the documentary is portrayed as like, oh, we just had really bad planning. Oh, we just didn't. And I'm just thinking like, no, there's no way. Like this very much seemed to me like a mass psychological experiment where they're putting a bunch of kids in here and they're getting a bunch of bands who, for the most part, you have like Wyclef, who's like but most of the bands were very aggressive types of music. Yeah. Especially the headlining acts that were towards the end of each night. And so, they terrible facilities. They're running out of water. When they can get water, it's like they kept jacking the prices of water up. I remember this. First it was 4, then it was 8, then it was 12, because they kept getting the supplies kept dwindling, and the place was just like a war zone. Now I was too much having fun to really realize how probably bad it really was at the time.
Right.
Again, thank God we had a more level-headed person to get us out of there before things just became a total disaster. But all I could think was like this. What really put it over the top for me was when they bring out these candles during the Chili Peppers concert, because they want to do this candlelight vigil. And the way they talk to Anthony, they show Anthony Kiedis, and they're like, oh yeah, we just decided to go play this Jimi Hendrix fire song. And they're singing, "Let me stand next to your fire." And of course, everyone starts lighting fires and the fire starts spreading. All I can think, there's no way that was just a random song that they sang innocently,
No.
and right before all the fires and everything happened, and then it just continued. I mean, and they kind of portray it all as well. The bands were just in the moment, and I don't even know if Anthony Kiedis is literally thinking I should sing this song about fire now, but someone is thinking it, and I don't think it's a coincidence that song was planned at the same time people were going to have access to a bunch of fire.
Yeah, I don't think so either. That's wow. I remember that. I didn't go.
I barely remember it, but yeah.
You barely remember. Well, I remember it was happening, but I was not there.
Yeah, I remember it was happening, and I was there. But yeah, I mean, it really made me, it kind of weirded me out because I was like, wow, I was part of a mass psychological operation. I'm fairly certain.
Yeah, I think that was definitely a mass psychological operation for sure.
Yeah, so I mean, if that one was, it certainly makes sense that the first one was, but it becomes so clear when you watch the documentary and you see. I mean, again, they don't portray it as any kind of operation at all, but I have to think it was, especially seeing how all the things that they did that would so obviously just put people in a worse place, that would just so obviously get people riled up and fired up. I mean, people were getting dehydrated, they didn't have food, they didn't have shelter, they didn't have water, and then we put in aggressive music that speaks about violence and fighting against the man, Rage Against the Machine. People were screaming, "Fuck you, I won't do what you tell me," while they're knocking down towers. I'm like, this is just so obvious to me that I'm glad I got out alive, I guess.
Yeah, I'm glad you got out alive too. I remember I went to a Snowasis concert, and there was like this huge, it was on a mountain, so it had snow and people were snowboarding and skiing, and it was an Oasis concert. But I remember there was a huge mosh pit, and my friends wanted to go up to the very front of the mosh pit, and some guy like picked me up and threw me onto a big pile of snow, and he told me that I was about to be stepped on and no longer exist. So it was apparently pretty dangerous.
Or was he saving you? He was like throwing you to the side.
He thought he was saving me. I was like,
doing his best.
WTF? Yeah. I mean, I'm like thrown onto a big pile of snow. He's like, no, I saved your life. You were about to cease to be.
Well, he might have. You might have been. Yeah, you might have been crushed by a sea of people.
Yeah, that's what he said. Yeah. I can read this to you because this is, so the man credited with Woodstock's creation was Artie Kornfeld, the director of Capitol Records, which owned EMI. Well, remember, EMI, led by aristocrat Sir Joseph Lockwood, stands for Electric Musical Industries, and unknown to most is one of Britain's largest producers of military electronics, a key member of Britain's military intelligence establishment. As a military contractor to the British War Office, and Tavistock was very instrumental in the war offices. Furthermore, EMI's silent partner is another major record label, RCA. RCA was also Serco. Serco is like this huge like government contractor. They have contracts with like the SES and obviously RCA. They were RCA, and they're like all over. It's a British company, but they have government contracts are all over the United States. So EMI silent partner, major record label, RCA, which was also active in military space, electronics, and satellite communication. Classic example of what President Dwight Eisenhower would have called a military-industrial complex. But it is really the one world government solidifying everything into fewer and fewer hands. The money for Woodstock was supplied by John Roberts, the heir of the large Pennsylvania-based block drugs pharmaceutical empire and toothpaste manufacturing fortune. Joel Roseman, one of the three partners, writes, as the concert neared, food and water were clearly going to be in short supply. Sanitary facilities overtaxed, temper short, drugs overabundant. Worst of all, there was no way for anyone who wanted to leave, which is a perfect environment for a psychological operation.
That's about the first Woodstock?
Yeah.
Yeah, because then that's even more mind-blowing because that is all the same mistakes they made at the second one, also making it so no one could leave. I mean, it's like, wow.
Yeah, well, I'm sure. I'm sure that they were trying to replicate a lot of the same, same study. So
And going to Woodstock was such a fantasy for like a teenager growing up and like listening to, because I got into that music as a teenager. I got into like all of that 70s and
I
rock
did
and that sort
too.
of stuff.
Yeah.
So then like hearing about, that's probably what drove me to, again, now I'm just analyzing my own psychological operations here. Like now I'm just thinking, of course I was told to love that music and worship that time, because then when they put out Woodstock 99, I was like, of course I'm going to go to Woodstock 99. And,
Yeah,
and
I'm surprised I didn't. I think I probably couldn't. Like I was probably doing something at that time, but I totally was into all that music. I went to the Grateful Dead concert. I went to his last one 6 months before Jerry Garcia died. So, yeah.
I've been to Fish concerts, but they're pretty chill. They're pretty chill. So I mean,
I
I
feel
will
like
say
Fish
that.
is more chill. Yeah, for sure. Went to quite a few.
Can we pretend Fish is legit? Can we pretend? I mean, I'm not really a Fish fan, but I want to think someone out there is just a good artist who got popular by their art and not because.
Well, I think, what I would say, CIA art is really good. That's why it's effective.
That's true.
Yeah. That's it has to be good. That's part of why the freedom movement, when I don't know what else to call them, but I wouldn't call them like right wing or like just the freedom movement. But when they do art, it typically sucks because they forget that it has to be good and they focus on being activists. You need to reverse it.
And it makes me wonder too, like, is good music actually good? Is it good, or is it that they figured out how do you design music in ways that please our brains in ways that suck us in, so therefore we remember that music and we think it's good? But is it
absolutely.
Yeah, is it that it's not that it's good, it's that it's created.
It's formulaic.
Exactly.
It's formulaic.
Exactly.
The Billy Joel song "Entertainer."
Mm-hmm.
There's a whole line. He says, "If you want to make a hit, you got to make it fit," and so they cut it down to 305.
Right.
Yeah. So I mean, it's a formula. The beat, the chorus, like the way it's structured, the whole thing is a formula.
And who's gonna be better at figuring out the formula than people that have been conducting high level military operations and this sort of thing? So it makes a lot of sense.
It makes sense. They've mastered it. Yeah, they've really mastered it. But I think that whole era, the counterculture, really was largely about drugs. I think the Beatles were a little bit different because that was a little bit more about hysteria. I think they were trying to, a lot of those, the testing was on like mass hysteria and how to create mass hysteria and hypnosis. I have read a lot on the Beatles and Tavistock connection. They talk a lot about that. Like, how do they hypnotize a mass population? How do you create a mass hysteria? How do you mind control, a large group? So I think that's largely what their purpose was. But yeah.
Can you kind of detail what some of the like hypnosis stuff with the Beatles is? Are there actual, songs you can think of where they're,
I don't know if the songs, I think it has more to do with them in person. I mean, like there's never been if you look throughout history, I mean, people are fanatics with, pop stars, but prior to the Beatles, there had never been that kind of hysteria. I mean, it was very hypnotic. I don't know specifically what the techniques they used to create that hypnosis were. I don't know if it had to do with the, sound waves or, I really don't know. But that I think is what they were experimenting with.
Of taking it and making it so like maybe just like music, it's like we're gonna figure out the formula for not just making someone become famous, but making it so you become infatuated with these people, and so you're obsessed with them. And this is another way. When we have you attached to something, we can then we can sort of lead you around.
Yeah, I mean that's really what it looks like. There had never been that kind of hysteria prior to. I mean, I wasn't around for the Beatles, but when you watch the videos and you watch the concerts, the way that people were acting, like it was like people just like throwing themselves at the stage. And I mean, it was really almost like they were under a trance. I think they've done a lot of experiments like since then. People have all sorts of theories about, what was it? Why am I blanking?
Oh, Astroworld.
Astroworld.
Yeah. With Travis Scott. Yeah.
Travis Scott. Exactly. So I mean, they've definitely done things since then, but I think that was one of the first of that kind at that time. So, yeah. Whereas people like the Grateful Dead and some of the others, that was much more about drugs, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and then there was, of course, like a lot of the music had very much, which is sort of ironic, but maybe not. It had this sort of anti-war, anti-establishment bent, and I used to think to myself, well, why would the establishment want to have anti-war stuff? Like, they want the wars, don't they? But then you realize it's like, oh no, they want you to think, they want mom and dad, regular sort of conservative American folks, to think anti-war, that's those crazy fucking hippies I just saw at Woodstock, like fucking each other in the middle of these fields and whatnot. So yeah, if that's anti-war, hell no.
Right.
So that's what I would think. It's more of discrediting the anti-war movement.
Well, and it's also, I think it's also dialectical. They want tension. So they want people protesting. They want people fighting. They want generations fighting with each other. So it's a great way to break up the family. You have the kids who are so wise and evolved, and they're fighting against war. Or mom, dad, you don't know anything. But they've already brainwashed the parents to say, well, we have to have war, right? Because that's how we get peace. That's what they told us. So that's a responsible thing to do. This was a quote from Aldous Huxley, and he this was a quote from him at the Tavistock Group, California Medical School in 1961. He says, there will be in the next generation or so a pharmacological method of making people love their servitude. This is a pretty famous, you probably heard it, but this is what I think the whole counterculture movement was all about. And producing dictatorship without tears, so to speak, producing kind of painless concentration camp for entire society so that people will, in fact, have their liberties taken away from them, but will rather enjoy it because they will be distracted from any desire to rebel by propaganda or brainwashing enhanced by pharmacological methods. And this seems to be the final revolution. Yeah.
And I think there is where we could also tie this into, and all of these things are ultimately inseparable. The psychedelics, the anti-war stuff, and then the new age aspect of this, which always keeps coming back into play here. And it's really hard to disconnect all these things, because I think when you kind of zoom out, they all do sort of move you in the same direction. They create more tension. They create more psychological issues, I would think, in the individuals themselves.
Well, they also blur boundaries, and that's a huge goal.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And then and speaking of blurring boundaries, we kind of went on a cult documentary sort of spree in my house in the last few months. We just got on a roll of watching all these different documentaries about various cults. I'm sure some of which are their own propaganda as well. So it's like, you know how we are at this point. You always have to look for how am I being played here? But it's interesting because that is always a first step, and a lot with cults, and it always starts very innocently-ish. It's always just one thing to get out of your comfort zone or something like that, and then they'll just say, well, look, you gotta be able to break your boundaries and whatnot. And of course, inevitably breaking your boundaries, it always ends up with you having to have sex with the leader of the cult at some point. It's like, that's we told you about breaking boundaries, but it's true, they do it on a small level. And once you can break your boundaries, maybe if you're breaking your boundaries at Woodstock or whatnot, you're the same person that can later be manipulated to jab your children.
Exactly. Which
is pretty literal, I think, in the case of the Woodstock generation looking towards now.
Yeah. Well, and Tavistock was very instrumental in, it was like one of the first to coin that term, world citizen. And that's, obviously we're seeing that come to play today. And it was in the 90s, but they did smart cards experiment. And that was, they're really doing it through education now. That's part of that whole universal choice education program.
Smart cards?
Yeah.
What is that?
It was a way of kind of like tracking kids to give them a universal passport. You needed these smart cards. Yeah. But it was a way of like figuring out where they would be in the world employment system. So, yeah. It
sounds like a caste system kind of thing. Like, it looks like,
doesn't it?
Looks like you'll be a middle class. You'll be like a plumber or something. Here you go.
Well, and when you read works of like Charlotte Iserbytten, who was a whistleblower under Reagan, actually, and her father was Skull and Bones, she talks about it. She talks about how that was part of their plan with the education system. John Taylor Gatto talks about it. Anthony Sutton, in his book On the Order of Skull and Bones, he talks about how the order took over education. He talks about it. But Tavistock actually did an experiment. It was when, during the 90s, they created a new journal. It was called Evaluation. They created smart cards, and it was for competence accreditation. So it was a way of kind of tracking, and I guess standardizing your skills. Yeah, they carried it out in the U.S. and parts of Europe. The project involved in assessing, validating students' skills with information placed on personal skills smart cards, which would become real passports to employment. The implication, of course, is that without this real passport, no one will be employed. And this is all about creating a global citizen, because that's what they were trying to do and they're still trying to do it. The whole plan is to, create kind of like a globalized workforce and, figure out where you can be a cog in this global machine.
And that is very much like a big message of the hippie new age movement, is that we're all citizens of the world. The earth is all ours, worlds beyond borders, all this stuff, which used to sound great to me when I was a kid, until you realize why they want all that and what that really entails.
Well, there's the Lucis Trust, and that's Alice Bailey's brainchild, and of course she was a theosophist.
There they are with the not so subtle Lucifer reference.
Well, it was Lucifer Publishing, okay, and then a year later, that it was very on the nose, but that didn't go over so well.
On the nose,
yeah. So they changed it like a year later, and they changed it to Lucis Trust. Lucis Trust.
We're gonna tone this down just a notch, but stay on the same general track.
Yeah. And they are a consultancy to the UN, and they're kind of like the religious, spiritual, if you will, underpinnings for the UN. And there's all sorts of subsets under there. There's like the Arcane Institute, which is their education section.
But then really not being subtle with the Arcane.
No, not at all.
It's like a supervillain organization or something.
But they have a festival every 7 years, and it's called the World Servers. It's festival week, and it's where world servers get together, and they literally call them world servers. Yeah, this is right on the website, on the UN's website. It's under the Lucis Trust.
So they're still having their own Woodstocks. I wonder if they're nearly as fun. Probably not. The world servers doesn't sound nearly as exciting anyway.
Doesn't sound as fun to me.
I just want to touch on as well, like what other, we've talked a lot about music, but what other aspects of culture can we see this influence in, besides the probably obvious answer of everywhere, but maybe more specifically so? Because I was thinking about even innocent stuff and I don't know if this stuff is directly Tavistock related, but anything that's not directly is probably indirectly. But like even just thinking back to the 90s and like the sitcoms I used to watch in the 90s, I feel like the sitcoms before that there was a lot of sitcoms about the family and showing a nice family unit, like, and whatnot. And then at some point in the 90s, like the most popular sitcoms were Seinfeld and Friends, which were my favorite shows at the time. And they both hold up pretty well now. But even now when I'm watching them, I still laugh at the jokes. But like I start to see a lot of the greater messaging, and it seems like the real thing that both of those shows were really showing is like, it's better to be single, it's better to have kids out of wedlock, divorce is great and normal, this and that. There was no happily married couples that ever existed. If there was a couple that was like in love, like a Ross and Rachel, they're always going to be having sex with other people, they're always going to be cheating, they're always going to be, and you never saw displays of just people getting married and having a family, and that was just not what was popular. And maybe it's we can argue all day whether it's, where the feedback begins. Is it that reflects the culture and that's why it's there? Or is it because that's what we want, where we want the culture to go? And I do feel like it definitely made me think like, I'm not saying Friends is what made me, not get married until my 40s, but it probably didn't hurt, because it made me think, oh yeah, this is what normal people do. They stay single, they party, they live in the city, and they don't need to get married. And it definitely helped normalize that idea for me, I would think.
Oh, I agree. I totally agree. I always say that I think Sex and the City had like the worst impact, particularly on women. It was definitely this message that like you could buy you could spend your rent on Manolo Blahniks, the shoes. And, that was kind of the message, one of the big messages of the show. And it seems really silly, like who would actually do that? I have friends who literally did that, and they'd be in debt and they'd be struggling to pay their rent because they bought like Jimmy Choos and Manolo Blahniks. And
wow.
Yeah, exactly. But that was really because they were watching the show that taught them that. And it totally created this messaging that, women can be promiscuous and, well into their middle age, and they would be happier that way. It created, I think it was really feminist propaganda. And I don't think that it served people. I think that people really ended up much more unhappy as a result of it. But I think that you're absolutely right. I think that the messaging of all of these shows in the 90s was definitely Tavistock propaganda. One of the main goals of Tavistock was to destroy the family. They wanted to overthrow Christianity. They wanted to destroy the family. And they were very instrumental in the feminist movement as well, because they thought that was a big conduit to both overthrowing Christianity as well as mostly Christian values. I think that's what they were concerned with more than like the institution of Christianity. And then, of course, feminism was a great way to destroy the family and to depopulate, right? Because if you have people not getting married, delaying, any kind of family creation.
So does Tavistock, I just imagine the answer is going to be yes to everything on this stuff. But does Tavistock play a role, considering their sort of medical, the way they push medical stuff? Do they have a role in the introduction of birth control? Because that is something that I've really, in my recent years in life, I have my wife having come off birth control a few years ago and seeing the difference in her, it made me realize, like, oh my God, you're putting teenagers on this. I mean, because now they just give it to girls when they're 15 if they have acne. Like, oh, this will regulate. And now they're just on this drug for the rest of, probably for at least a lot of their adult life until they go to have kids. And I got to imagine it for many women, it probably means they don't have kids, because maybe they just stay on it for a certain amount of time and it messes up their system a lot. You hear a lot more about, difficulty with pregnancies than you did 20, 30 years ago. So I do wonder how many women just end up not ever having successful pregnancies because they got on birth control so early.
Yeah. Wow. You actually noticed a difference in your wife when she went off of it?
Huge. Luckily, luckily it was a good, because I mean, I've heard stories the other way. I've heard stories where people like are no longer attracted to each other because the wife, was on all these hormones. So they were attracted to this kind of person. So it worked out fine on that end, but definitely like much, much better. It helped. Well, I don't want to get into details here, but we all agree. Yeah. Okay. We all agree it was a positive,
it was a positive thing.
But it was we never even thought, or she never really thought about it before as a, obviously we know the hormones all affect everything, but I mean, it's just night and day. And then it really dawned on her, like, oh my God, I never even thought about not taking this because doctors just give it to you. Like, it's no big deal. Like, it's what you're supposed to take, even if you're not having sex.
Right. And then there's a huge push for that. So I don't know, like directly Tavistock, but I would definitely say at least indirectly, because, we talked about the medical hygiene, Institute. We talked about the mental hygiene. Then there was the social institute. There was the psychical institute, and then there was the psychology. I think it was it the medical psychology institute? It was something like that. But these people were all eugenicists, and they were all tied into the birth control movement. That was Bill Gates's father. That was Margaret Sanger. And they were very overt about it when they created it. I mean, it was that now they tout it as this great, healing product and you're absolutely right. They put all teenagers on it. I mean, it's like what they push for almost everyone. Any woman who comes in childbearing years, if they're either don't want to get pregnant, or they're dealing with some sort of a hormonal issue, which today it seems like. Which
is probably every teenager.
Right. Like every teenager, but it's like, oh, you're having acne. Oh, wait, you weren't happy today. Or, I'm being absurd, but to make the point, because.
So we could either give you this birth control, or have you considered you're trapped in the wrong body?
Right.
It's got to be one of these things.
It's got to be one of the two. So either we'll give you this pill to sterilize you, or we will just castrate you and sterilize you that way. One or the other, take your pick. So I don't know. I can't say that it was like part of an overarching Tavistock mission, but there's a lot of overlap between the people who were under Tavistock and, these different organizations have this.
It does sound like one of those things where it's like you don't always need the direct conspiracy because they're all moving in the same direction. So if all these people come from the same, whether it's specifically Tavistock or it's one of the organizations that they're all connected to, they all share this same philosophy. They all want to move the world in the same direction. So they don't need to have a smoke-filled room meeting to iron out all the details. They already agree. So they're going to go into their institutions and their various positions of power and implement what they already agree on. So you don't always need to have the evidence of the meeting because you don't even need the meeting.
I would say that it is even more direct than that, though, because these different organizations like the mental hygiene, the medical hygiene, the Psychical Institute, all of these do have overlap, and they were all eugenicists, and they all did work with Tavistock. So, and
I just mean on more of the general cultural.
But in general, I agree. Yeah. Although when you talk about the smoke-filled room, that's so funny because I remember I'm blanking on which musician it was, but it was like a whistleblowing video, and he talked about Tavistock approaching him and like having this whole meeting that like. To
smoky room.
It was a smoke-filled room, and it was like, and it was to push propaganda. I'm blanking. I'm sure I'll remember as soon as I get off. But if I
ever got pulled aside and to talk to about like helping create some propaganda, I would be like, "Where is the smoke? You better give me. Come on, at least give me the smoke in the room."
Yeah, exactly.
So Courtenay, are there any other areas or any other just maybe general facts about Tavistock or things we haven't covered that are just important things to know before we wrap up?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important for people I know people they love to hear about like the entertainment stuff. And with the entertainment stuff, I will just say a couple of quick things is that, they did all of these experiments as the technology increased. So as it advanced, like there was the whole radio experiment, with the very famous like War on the Worlds, H.G. Wells, they did that whole experiment that was connected to Tavistock. And that was under Rockefeller. His roommate was Cantrill was Rockefeller at Dartmouth. And that was all about like, mass psychosis and what would the impact of, some sort of a crisis be on the masses. So, and that was interesting because they did the experiment and this was how radio would impact people and the psychology of radio, I think is what it was called. But it was interesting because they didn't release the results. Rockefeller wouldn't let him release the results for 2 years. And there's 2 or 3 years. And then they did. They released it later. Then a few years later, when television came out, they did the same kind of like psychological experiments with television. What would the impacts of television be on psychology? And then, of course, they later use it to create specific type of shows. And they have all these liaisons. They did it with film as well. And they have all these liaisons. And through like the CIA, if you just go to their website, right out like in the open, it's very transparent. It's one of their front pages. They have a film liaison. And they advertise like all the shows that they've worked with, like television shows, film shows, movies that they've consulted with. So it's very overt. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is out in the open, very public knowledge.
Well, people will say they're just getting like advice on what it really looks like in this situation or that situation. And it's not that they're coming in and telling us what to do, but it's probably a little bit of that too.
It is. And it's very traceable. I mean, that is not like hidden. They've been pretty transparent on that. So that, and of course we've seen Tavistock works with the CIA and they, work directly with the film liaison, the radio back then. So I'll say that, but one of their main missions has always been through like wartime research. And it's always under the guise of wartime research. And I think that's important for people to understand because so much of what gets weaponized against the masses is wartime research. And of course, under psychological research. Like that's where we get a lot of this psychological warfare and all the psyops that get unleashed. But it's not just psychological warfare. I mean, it's biological warfare. They did that whole bombing experiment out of Germany. This was Tavistock. And that was the kind of the precursor to Operation Phoenix in Vietnam. Was it Vietnam or Korea? But Operation Phoenix. And that was, I'm going to look it up because
What is the German experiment?
It was a bombing experiment to see how they bombed civilians to see how if people would be how the people would be impacted, the trauma.
Oh, you mean like during World War II?
Yes, during World War II.
Right. When they would intentionally, exactly. Okay. I didn't realize that was, okay, that's interesting. I mean, I knew about those bombing campaigns, but I didn't realize that they were done with the idea of experiment as much as just like, we're going to kill people because it's war and that's what we're doing.
It was Vietnam, Operation Phoenix. Yeah, okay. I thought so. Yeah, but that bombing experiment was a precursor to Operation Phoenix.
And it was to see how civilian populations reacted to very obvious attacks on just civilians.
Exactly.
Wow.
I know. So I think
somehow that's even worse than just killing them to kill them.
It is. Yeah. So I just think that's really important for people to understand that, like, I know people get really they're fascinated by the whole culture war, and that's obviously it's really important, but it's a lot of this underground military research is what they're involved in, and that does end up getting weaponized against the people. And even this culture war stuff came out of military research. A lot of the culture war came out of research done on the Cold War. I mean, they used impressionistic art and all this is like kind of degenerative art as a way of psyoping during the Cold War. So even that was wartime research. But yeah, I think their goal now, I mean, people do know now that they're they're pushing all of this transgender stuff, but they're also really working on the transhuman stuff. So I think that's less visible. Like I said, they did a bunch of symposiums and they were advertising them and then they deleted it. I can't find it anymore. So that's curious too.
Interesting. Well, Courtenay, thank you so much for joining me, not just today, but also for the first part we did. I think this has been a pretty comprehensive look at Tavistock. Again, and maybe this is why, because like you said, I didn't realize it was very recent that the name started coming out with related specifically to that transgender. So that's probably why I just noticed hearing it a lot in the last couple of years. But this has really, I guess, been the genesis of people. I guess it's been a way for people to really point the finger at maybe the hidden hand between a lot of what people could make connections to before, but now they can say, well, look, we can all point it right back to this same place.
Yeah. And they have so many their tentacles everywhere. Mm-hmm. Like when I was trying to research some of their shell organizations, they've got like Tavistock, like funding groups. They've got like Tavistock architecture groups. And I think that's part of a psyop too. I'm sure that they're doing research. I mean, brutalist architecture was part of a psyop to depress people, demoralize people. So I'm sure they're working on various types of architecture and infrastructure to figure out how to manipulate.
Any architecture after 1950 feels like a psyop to me, because I feel like the only time I see anything nice around any city is when I'm like, oh, that's a nice old building. I never say that about a new building.
No. Well, I think there've been some. Yeah, rarely. But yeah, so they have so many different subgroups and shell companies and some not shell company, but it's really hard to trace all of the tentacles. But when you look at the funding for them, I mean, it really does seem to all go back to the same people. It's the Crown, the Milners, the Rothschild, the Rockefellers. Certainly the Rockefellers gave them that very big grant in 1947 for them to become the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations. And so it's kind of all the same players, but yeah. I think that covers like a sliver, but yeah,
a sliver, right. Like I said, you could probably have a daily podcast to dive into all the different areas that Tavistock has had their hands in. But Courtenay, thank you so much for joining me. Before we jump over into, I think if you have time, we'll jump over to the smoke-filled room for a minute. It's our own smoke-filled room, but feel free to just plug away on everything you got. Of course, the Courtenay Turner program, and I think you're doing about 22 podcasts a day now. So.
Something like that. Yeah. Maybe not quite that many, but it does feel like that. It's CourtenayTurner.com, and I spell my name a little differently. So it's like Courtenay, Courtenay, Turner.com. And yeah, you can find everything, all the links to my different social medias and all the podcast platforms.
That's the easiest thing to do now. Just get the one name, just make the website your name and say everything's there instead of naming a bunch of things. That's what I did too. It's a lot easier. Courtenay, thank you so much. And I'll see you over in the smoke-filled room.